My name is Rutger Bregman. I'm a Dutch historian, and right now I'm sitting here in Amsterdam to give a talk about one of the most radical ideas out there. It's an idea that if you fully think it through, you'll realize that it has massive implications for everything, and it will completely help you to rethink who we are as a species. Now, if I would sum up the idea in just a couple of words, it would be something like, most people, deep down, are pretty decent. But the whole story starts actually with an old idea that is sometimes described by, in this case, the Dutch scientist Frans de Waal as Veneer Theory. Veneer Theory is one of the most pernicious ideas, particularly in Western culture. It comes back again and again and again. It's this notion that our civilization is just a thin layer, just a thin veneer, as they call it, and that below that lies raw human nature. That supposedly we humans are just selfish deep down, that we're animals or even beasts, that we cannot be trusted, basically. Now, the idea, as I said, is very, very influential, particularly in Western culture, and it comes back again and again. So if you go back like more than 2,000 years to the ancient Greeks, you read the works of, for example, Thucydides, the great Greek historian, who already believed that humans are like this. Or you look at the Christian church fathers, St. Augustine, for example, who believed in this notion of original sin, that we humans are all sinners deep down and that we can only be saved by God and His grace and mercy. Now, what you would suspect is that when the Enlightenment came along, this period in the 17th and the 18th century that is sometimes called as the Age of Reason, that there should have been some kind of break, that maybe people started to look in a different way at us humans. But the reality is actually the opposite. What you see if you study the great Enlightenment philosophers, famous thinkers such as John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Thomas Hobbes, whom we'll talk about later, what you actually often see is the continuity, is that most of the Enlightenment philosophers, not all of them, but most of them, most of these great thinkers that laid the basis for modernity also had a quite cynical view of human nature. And one of the main points that I'm going to try to make in this series of lectures is that Veneer Theory is wrong, that it's basically incorrect, that humans are not like that. Our civilization is not just a thin veneer, absolutely not. No, actually our civilization is much, how do you say that? It's much sturdier, much stronger, and especially in times of crises, we can actually often rely on one another. But let's first dig a little bit deeper into this idea of what Veneer Theory really is. It's very important to understand that there was this one philosopher, the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who is sometimes described as the father of realism. He lived in the 17th century, which was a very tough era in European history. This was an era of pandemics, of a plague, and much worse than COVID-19. It was also an era of warfare, of very horrible religious warfare. Actually, Thomas Hobbes himself had to flee the UK because he was being persecuted. And maybe because of those circumstances, he developed a quite cynical idea of what humans are really like. So in his most famous book, which is called The Leviathan, he made the case that back in the old days, in prehistory, as they call it, or as the philosophers back then called it, the state of nature, when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, most of us lived pretty terrible lives. Now, Thomas Hobbes believed that at some point in this terrible history a long time ago, something changed, and we established what these philosophers called a social contract, and we appointed a ruler, which he called a Leviathan, to rule us all. We gave up our freedom, the freedom that had terrible consequences, and we got security in return, right? So we moved from a relatively egalitarian era where we were basically fighting with each other to a more hierarchical era that was much more stable. Now, this worldview has been very, very influential. I think it's one of the reasons why Veneer Theory, the notion that people are just selfish deep down, is still so popular. Because if you and I, if we cannot trust each other, then we need a Leviathan. We need a ruler to keep us in check, right? If we can actually trust each other, then maybe we can organize our society in a completely, radically different way. And that was actually the argument of Thomas Hobbes's great adversary, and that was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher. Now, he lived later in the 18th century. They never spoke to one another because Thomas Hobbes was already dead when Rousseau was born. But in the history of philosophy, they're often seen as these opponents who are, fighting with each other because they have completely different, opposite worldviews. You remember that Thomas Hobbes was quite cynical about the state of nature, the world in which we lived when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers. Rousseau actually argued the opposite. He said that in the state of nature, life was pretty good. For him, everything went wrong when we settled down, when we invented private property, when we invented this thing that we historians call civilization. So civilization was not a blessing, no, it was actually a curse, according to Rousseau. So as you can see, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau had completely different worldviews. The implications, of course, of Rousseau's worldviews were radical. We've seen this shift where actually the latest findings of these scientists are much more in line with Rousseau's conception of world history than with Thomas Hobbes' conception. So, for example, we've got a lot of evidence now from archaeology about the deep history of warfare. And it turns out, actually, that warfare is a quite recent invention. The era of warfare really started mostly when people settled down, when they invented agriculture, when they built these villages and cities, etc., etc. And before that, in the era in which we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, which has been the biggest part of our history, don't forget about that, we were actually relatively peaceful. I'm not saying that humans are angels or anything like that, obviously not. I mean, we're capable of jealousy and aggression and you name it. That's always been the case and that will always be the case. What I am saying is that what we assume in other people is what we get out of them. This is not just philosophy. What you assume is the kind of behavior that you elicit out of people. If you're a manager, for example, of a company, and you assume that most of your employees are just these selfish, lazy pricks, well, what are you going to do? You're going to build all these layers of hierarchy. Maybe you're going to have cameras in the building to make sure that you can control the employees. And you're going to create the kind of people that your theory presupposes. So theories are never just theories. Stories are never just stories. What we assume in each other is what we get out of each other. The stories that we tell about ourselves is what we become in the end. And that is one of the most important reasons why we need a new theory of human nature, because we got to change the world.